Hello and welcome to some Derps Talk About Games. I'm your host, Mango.
And I'm your co-host, Buddy.
And today we're going to talk about different perspectives on how to play and run tabletop games. But before we get into that, Buddy, why don't you tell the audience what this cast is about?
Well, it's pretty simple, Mango. We like to talk about games. I think before we get into all of this crunchy, great Pathfinder goodness, though, I just want to check in with you. How was your week, Mango? It's Thanksgiving.
Yeah.
Good time to play some video games?
Not a lot, because I was busy eating turkey with you and Mark, guest of the show, or guest on the show a while ago. Will be a guest in the future as well. But yeah, what did I played some Alawi, the new league champion. She's a lot of fun. I actually like her a lot. I am getting used to the fact that she has zero to no escapes, unlike, say, Garen, who at least has his Q that lets him run away a little bit. But she's still a lot of fun. And I'm also enjoying the new ADC changes. Other than that, just more Fallout, because, of course, recently found my first Gauss rifle, which is neat.
I too have found my first Gauss rifle, and it has basically made the game unplayably easy.
Oh man, I'm not quite there yet. Although I am every once in a while. Oh, I found the railway rifle, which made me the happiest motherfucker in the world.
Oh, okay.
Because I love that. I always love that gun. Just the choo choo. It's so great. But on that kind of note, I'm playing on very hard, and I might scale it up to survival. But I was playing on very hard, and I had a challenging encounter, so I might be at about the right thing, but most of the time it's way too easy. So I might pump it up to survival because, as a player, I've been kind of pushing the systems, which of course I'm sure you have too.
Yeah, the system. I've been playing it very hard as well. The reason I don't go up to survival though is it really removes my ability to. If I pump to survival, I just sit and snipe down every encounter from 200 yards and never. You know what I mean? Like now, I give myself kind of the leeway to make mistakes. Sometimes when I'm just in a hurry and I don't give a shit, I'll just run in with like Kellogg's pistol or like Righteous Authority or something and just, pull up VATS, shoot a bunch of dudes in the head. I'll take a bunch of damage, pop a few stim packs, whatever kind of thing. And I feel I'm afraid that if I pop up to survival, I'm going to lose the ability to just kind of not.
Yeah, that's fair. So, one other thing, though, that I wanted to say before I toss it over to you for your week, because I know you're eager to talk about some stuff that you've been doing, is I did go back and I played a little bit more of the demo for Indivisible, which is an indie, or it's by the guys who made Skullgirls. It's kind of like a JRPG. I've heard the comparison's been made to a Valkyrie Profile. It's kind of like a real-time style JRPG with different inputs for different commands. It's pretty cool. And it's at 1.3 million of 1.5 million. It's got, at the time of recording, 4 days left. So if we can hit that 1.5 on Indiegogo, that would be great, because I think it's going to be an awesome game. I think I'm going to up my personal contribution later tonight, because I really want to see this succeed. And the guys I've listened to, the guy Mike Z, who's one of the heads of the project, say that essentially they can't go back to working for other people. So if this project fails, they're going to go do something else with their lives. And I would hate to see that happen. So if you like JRPGs, go check out the demo. I'll put a link in the description, and give those guys some money, because the game looks awesome.
In which Mango gets guilt-tripped by the developer at a company.
My really guilt-tripped, right? Like, I donated to it. And if it doesn't succeed, I don't get to play the game. So I want to play the game.
I feel that. I beat StarCraft 2. I haven't beaten the epilogue yet, but I have beat the regular campaign. It's not quite as good as Wings of Liberty, but it's better than Heart of the Swarm. And it's better than Heart of the Swarm for kind of a very specific reason. But I do want to give a little bit of a spoiler warning here for people who are super, super, if you're a diehard fan, really, really into the game, feel free to just kind of pause it here, We'll put a link to the time when I stopped talking about StarCraft in the comments, and you can fast forward to that spot. But if you're kind of mediocre on the game and you're just like, like, do I want to pick this up? Let me see if I can make a little bit of a case using a little bit of spoilers. Okay. There's a couple of different ways that you upgrade your units. In Wings of Liberty, you integrate kind of Zerg biotechnology and Protoss kind of like physics technology into your units in order to kind of give them this upgrade tree, make them better, right? You also pay for upgrades with credits that you earn off of each individual mission. You literally buy them. In Heart of the Swarm, you upgrade in a couple of different... You have these small evolutions, which are little things, that are incidentally good, that make your units a little bit different. And then bigger evolution missions that really change the core of this unit from one thing into another thing or supplement it in some kind of way, right? In Legacy of the Void, you align your units to a different faction, right? And for people who don't know StarCraft lore all that well, there's a couple of different factions in the Protoss, right? Because you have, the High Templar, the Kalai, which are, the regular Templar. And then in Brood War, they introduced the Dark Templar, who have, they've severed their nerve cords and they refuse the Kala. And then they introduced two new factions, the Purifiers, a group of robots basically created by the Templar, and then eventually put into kind of stasis and lockdown because they didn't quite... They treated these robots as slaves and they rose up on them. Haha, who's ever heard about that happening ever before? And the fourth faction... This is kind of where the spoiler is, are the Tal'Darim, who are actually bad guys who you fight against in both Wings of Liberty and Heart of the Swarm. The Tal'Darim worship the Xel'Naga as gods, and so they are, being controlled by Amon, the big bad of Legacy of the Void, right? This faction system is so great. Oh my god, it's so beautiful because every mission you can customize, whether you're using, traditional Dragoons, the Dark Templar Stalkers, or a new unit that's that kind of fills that mid-ranged armored warrior, right? Depending on what, and so you can move and shift between these. They bring back all of these old units. You can swap out Void Rays for Arbiters if you want to go back to playing StarCraft 1, or you can swap out Colossi for Reavers if you want to go back to playing StarCraft 1. It's so cool. I was so happy with that. But the best part of it is these characters who are the faction leaders are fucking amazing. The most notable of this, and he's the guy that I swear I'm just going to be on his dick for like the rest of the year. All right, I'm sure we'll do some kind of like awardsy episode, and I'm going to talk about him in our awardsy episode. His name is Alarak, and he's the leader of the Tal'Darim, and he's just... Please just go look up like all of his quotes on YouTube. They're hilariously good because he's so biting and he's such a dick, but they're just they're so well written. Like, this is one of his quotes, right? One of the faction leaders said, is telling the Tal'Darim all about what the Zerg did to Iron. They say, the Zerg are our greatest opponents. Only a fool would underestimate them. And Alarak goes, then I shall defer to you as the fool. And I literally had to pause the game because I was laughing so hard at that line. There's another one where, even these little things where you just kind of get into his philosophy and how he sees the world, and where he says, freedom is a delusion given to the weak by the strong. And I was just like, man, that one sentence is better writing than like the entirety of, Preston Garvey's character in Fallout 4. The faction leaders are really, really great, and they're really the way that Legacy of the Void becomes better than Heart of the Swarm for me, because they are independent characters who serve a real purpose, right? To familiarize both the player with the different factions that they're leading, and as a reflecting point for Artanis, who is kind of nominally the leader of the whole band, but he's actually the youngest and most experienced of them. And so you get to see Alarak, or Vorazun, or the other faction leader who I won't talk about, in part on Artanis their worldview and how he might change how the Templar behave because of that. And it's so great because it really kind of creates this whole theme of, the unity and overcoming these stupid cultural barriers that have been dividing the Protoss for so long. StarCraft II Legacy of the Void 100% gets my recommendation for anybody who is, a big story guy, big character guy, big RTS guy, any of those things. That campaign was so well done.
Well, that sounds awesome. You might have actually sold me on that. I might have to check that out when I've got some extra time at home.
Please do. Please do also because they added those co-op missions, and I have nobody to play the co-op missions with because Zhao was on the East Coast, but now he's back, so I guess I can play with him.
You can anyway play with Monic.
Yeah, it's also true.
I think just because I'm going to be on the East Coast soon, I'm gonna not have my desktop, not be able to play Fallout. I think I'm gonna start playing Undertale, which has received a lot of critical acclaim. And I'm excited to kind of explore that. I know that the gaming press in general has been enamored with it. Our friend Barry is kind of enamored with it. I've only heard good things. And so I'm looking forward to having a controversial opinion about it. Although I do hope that it's good because, I'd obviously rather play a good game than play a game that everybody thought was good that I didn't think was good. But yeah, that's for the future. Why don't we start to dig into some of this tabletop stuff? I believe you kind of wanted to lead off with this thought about something that's very near and dear to my heart and yours, which is essentially to kind of summarize the idea behind it. There's this kind of theory that there are two types of people that play Dungeons & Dragons. There are theater kids, and then there are Captain Crunches. Captain Crunch being a term invented by my esteemed co-host, Buddy Sola.
On this very podcast. I think you can hear me make that joke on episode 2 or 3, right?
I like it a lot. I like the term a lot. But yeah, why don't you just go into it? Sorry for interrupting.
Yeah, so I've been thinking about this term a lot, these two terms a lot in preparing for Hell's Rebels because, I'm preparing for this game. It's a very RP heavy game. We're probably going to do a more in-depth cast about kind of the behind the scenes of Hell Rebels eventually, but just as a teaser for that way in the future, one of the things that kind of bugs me a bit about the game is the first 2 books, the third book has been much better about this, is very it's much more dungeon crawly than I expected, right? This was very much billed to me as the super social, the super RP heavy AP, and there's all these, and I open it up and I'm just like, what the fuck are all these dungeons doing in here kind of thing. And so I'm a tinkerer. I love tinkering with my games, and I've been really caught between my natural tendency to hardcore tinker and what I know are my players' kind of fervent adherence to rule sets, right? When I'm playing when I first learned how to play the game, Rule 0, the rule that the GM is God and he can change anything, right? Expect table variation is the way that Pathfinder Society puts it. It was very, very. It was used all the time, right? Because none of us were masters of the rules. None of us, the PFSRD didn't exist. Pathfinder didn't exist. We were going off of the D&D 3.5 handbook and actually just the monster manual. We didn't even have the Dungeon Master's Guide. So we were making up all of this stuff on the fly. And so for a lot of my friends, that kind of, the gears are working behind the scenes. Just trust us. You're in it for the story and the experience. Don't worry so much about the numbers of the die. Is something that I have very deeply instilled from, my high school days of playing. But when I, hit college and I founded HPPG with my esteemed colleagues, including some other people that you may have heard us mention on this cast, it was very apparent that kind of player who was very liberal with the rules, who changed rules kind of on the fly, in order to facilitate the mechanics of the story, that wasn't something that worked as well. And so now I'm kind of torn between it because I know that I have a bunch of Captain Crunch players who are super into the rules, who definitely want to know all of the numbers and why they exist and where they come from, right? How many hit dice and why does he have that much HP for that hit dice, right? whether or not his constitution modifier is X or Y, because I want to make sure that I should use my reflex or my fortitude save spell against this kind of thing, right? Like all of these different things. These are what Captain Crunches really focus on. And, the theater kids, the people who are in it for the story, who are in it for the characters, because they love to improvise, because they want to be, this reactive protagonist who gets kind of, he gets all of this information from the GM, and he decides to make a certain subset of decisions because he's role-playing. These are people that don't necessarily, think as hard about that kind of stuff, right? And if I'm changing rules in, behind the scenes in order to make situations more dramatic, in order to pump up, bad guys, or, make something really pop in a way, that's something that a theater kid loves, theoretically. So those are kind of the genesis of how I think about, these two distinctions. Mango, because you were one of the first players to experience the shifting tides of my GMing style, have I explained the difference adequately?
I think you've done a fair job. I think there's
high praise. A fair job.
No. I think you've as I feel like someone who comes at it kind of from more of a theater kid desire, if not always a theater kid kind of practice person. I think you kind of miss part. I think you make it sound like Captain Crunch kids do it just for the numbers, because the numbers are the only things they want to do. And for some people, that's certainly true. And that's definitely a part of it. But I think there's also kind of like a kind of aspect of the fantasy, which is, can I make my character as good as it can be type of deal, right? Like that kind of, desire to be not just a swordsman, but an exceptional swordsman type of deal. An exceptional swordsman that you did with, I think this kind of goes back to my favorite thing, the sacred contract of the rules, which is essentially it's about the fact that, if I'm being an exceptional swordsman within the bounds of the rules, that's something that I can be happy that I accomplished, rather than something that I just get told as kind of a story point. Like, I feel like I have control over that situation, which I think kind of leads into, there's a very specific story that kind of is the genesis of this talk, which is at the very beginning of Buddy's transition, where I was one of his players. And I think I'm going to relate this story because I think it kind of gets this my point across well, which is, we were fighting. We were at a big boss level encounter kind of at the end. And I'm playing a 3/5 wizard at the time. And I don't have a lot of spells at this point. I think I'm level 5. So I think I have like one level 3 spell. But we're against the boss. I'm like, okay, this is where I have to blow it. I need to shoot my lightning bolt at the boss, because that's the right thing to do. Like, that's what I do. I'm a caster. I nuke the boss. And so I get myself set up. I line myself up, and I shoot this lightning bolt at this boss. And I roll. I'm like, all right, I've done this thing. This is great. I'm gonna crap all over this boss. And Buddy, my dear GM, looks at me and says, and he says, the boss catches your lightning bolt with his rapier and deflects it. And at the time, I would like to say, to my credit, I did not complain. I just kind of held resentment in my heart for years.
For years and years.
But it's kind of deflated, right? Like, like you say, like, changing things behind the scene to make the scene pop, to make the story more dramatic. And what I was upset about, essentially, is that my agency had been stripped from me, essentially. My ability to control the situation, my ability to contribute had been pulled away, especially kind of in this particular case where I'm blowing my biggest daily resource on this big fight, only for it to amount to nothing, not because of any particular rules contrivance, which makes, it feels better, right? Like, if you had said, and, he has evasion or something, I probably would have been like, well, that sucks, but okay. Right? Like, that's the price you pay. But it was kind of like very, very much like just kind of like a story hand wave. And that's kind of, that kind of pulls away what I think a lot of Captain Crunch kids want to get out of the game, which is essentially the sense of agency and the sense of control over this game world and this ability to be something great rather than just kind of being a character in a story that someone else is telling.
Sure, but that's also kind of a trust thing, right? Like, you have to trust me that I'm gonna get you there, right? This comes from, this very much comes from where I was playing in high school all the time, right? And like I said, my friends and I didn't have a complete mastery of the rules. We didn't even own the DMG. We played we played a little bit of D&D 3.5, but most of what we played was the Star Wars D&D, or the Star Wars D20 system. And we, all of us would do this kind of shit all the time, where the rules wouldn't quite work, but it made sense. And it was the same kind of thing where, like, sometimes we would cheat for the bad guy, right? And sometimes we would cheat for, like, the good guy. Like, the most famous example of this is, and please remember, we were teenagers playing Star Wars. It wasn't the smartest thing. Anyway... the genesis of this story was that a droid was pretending to be a Sith Lord, and he had activated the Confederate, or not the Confederate. It is the Confederate, right? The Confederate droid army from the prequel trilogy, and he had activated them several decades after the end of Return of the Jedi, and he was using them to besiege Coruscant, right? We were trying to go get some, MacGuffin at the top of some super high Coruscant building, and we were racing against time, and the building was collapsing all around us, and we opened the elevator to go back down to the bottom, and there is the big, big bad, this droid Sith Lord. And now, we're all sitting there like, oh god, we're gonna have a fucking big-ass boss fight while this whole thing is coming down, we're super fucked. But a friend of mine was just like, yo, dude, why don't you just cut the cables? And we were all just like, wait, what? Wait, what do you mean cut the cable? He was like, well, he's sitting in this elevator, right? And, like, we rolled the initiative. Why don't you just go over there, cut the cables? He falls, a million stories to his death. And so that's exactly what we did. I was a Jedi. I pulled out my lightsaber. I cut the cables, even though it was technically a repulsor pad. And, and he fell to the bottom of this tower and died. Technically speaking, right? That's not really a raw thing. That's not really a raw interaction that happened. But for the story, it just felt so good, right? Like, what a great way to think about, like, to think around this problem, right? And there was this huge, he comes out of nowhere, and you immediately dispatch of him just by thinking on your feet and improvising. And I think that's what, theater kids are looking for. That moment. The rules of that moment don't really matter, right? And in the same sense, the buddy who was GMing your game, the rules of the lightning bolt didn't matter all that much because he had to establish that he was the boss. He had to establish that he was a big motherfucking badass, right? And so that's why, that's why I made the decision I did. Obviously, I was misreading the crowd, right? But I think that, there's something to that, right? There's a nugget of truth in there that I will defend.
Sure. And I think that there's kind of a difference there too that I think is worth exploring. Like, there's a difference between when a player comes up with something that isn't really covered by the rules and you kind of have to go at it with kind of your improvised knowledge. And then when you take something that is clearly governed by the rules and then throw that out the window to kind of fit the narrative you want to tell.
It's covered by the rules. There's hardness, right? There's all that shit.
Sure, but like the position, like what that hardness would be, the positioning, like it, can I go cut the cables, right? Like, that's a question that only the GM can really answer, right? Like, is there enough of an angle? That kind of thing.
Right. And if we were raw, I probably wouldn't have been able to, right? But it didn't matter.
And I don't know if that's... Because, so, I don't know if that's necessarily true, right? Like, you would have had to have probably rolled a hard check for it, but, like, that's not something, that you looked at that and you said... well, there's a rule that applies here, but I'm going to ignore it, right? Like, that's something where you said, well, the rule here is kind of wonky and either takes up too much time to look up, or I just don't know what it would be, so I have to make something up, versus something with this lightning bolt, which is, I have a rule, it's right in front of me, and I'm willfully going to ignore it because it makes for a more dramatic scene.
I will certainly agree that one is more tactful than the other, but they are both clear instances of the rules being ignored, right?
See, I don't know. I think
whether or not we knew the rules at the time, and I understand,
Sure.
yeah, it is way more obvious. It is way more obvious the rules that govern spell combat, obviously, in D&D 3.5 than the rules that govern the hardness of, an elevator in a mid-level skyscraper in Coruscant, right? One of those is much more arcane than the other, but fundamentally speaking, these are both disregarding the rules in order for something for some narrative purpose to happen.
See,
right?
I don't really think that first one was disregarding the rules that much, right? Like, what if you had gone and looked it up, it would have been like a hardness check versus a lightsaber, which I'm sure can fucking cut through whatever, because that's the thing that lightsabers do, right? Like, that doesn't feel like a big offense to me. Whereas man deflects lightning, or goblin deflects lightning bolt with a rapier is not something that a goblin can do.
Whether or not it's a, I mean, he can do it. He just needs to have he needs to make his reflex check and have evasion. Right?
Sure.
But I get what you're getting at, right? Degrees, and I'm 100% with you that the lightning
enough.
bolt is like the more egregious kind of break. I just think fundamentally they're both break. You know what I mean? They're comparable in the sense that at the end of the day,
Sure.
they're both breaking, and one of them is on one side and one of them is on the other side. Anyway,
So before we get too far beyond that, I think something else I wanted to point out too, which is kind of a sad reality too, of this, is that one of these is a player doing something, and one of these is taken against the player, which is, it might not sound fair, but it's kind of like it feels, at least in my gut, I don't know if I can kind of write this down to numbers, is that like when a player wants to do something neat, I tend to err on letting them try, if it's reasonable. Whereas if it's taking something away from the player, that kind of feels shitty.
So wait. I'm actually of the opinion that they're both. It's all dependent on context, right? I think sometimes it's important to, quote unquote, fuck over your players a little bit in order to, in order to heighten the stakes, right? In order to make them feel, the kind of the danger of the situation. In fact, I think if there's any kind of criticism that I would, hit a Captain Crunch kind of player or Captain Crunch kind of DM with, it's that, when you're just going by raw, when you're just going hardcore by the rules, you get these really kind of interesting, Rube Goldberg machines where all of these systems kind of collide in a certain subset of ways that's really just kind of hilarious and interesting. But I think depending on that kind of randomness at its core, in order to make that happen, is just... It's not great storytelling, right? You have to have a firmer hand than that, and sometimes that means you're going to screw over your players a little bit for this narrative effect, right?
So I think the difference here is not like, it's not wrong to put your players into a challenging situation, and I don't think it would have been wrong for your GM at the time to have said it's a repulsor lift, that won't work. But I think it's worse to take something away from a player arbitrarily than it is to give something to a player arbitrarily.
It's not, but see, I guess my perspective is it wouldn't be arbitrarily. If it's for the story, it's not arbitrary. It's for a narrative purpose, right? And that's important. I mean, that's important to me at the very least. And whether or not I'm letting a player do this thing arbitrarily because I want them to feel like a huge badass and that's a super clever idea, versus I want to negate this thing the player is doing because I want them to feel the high stakes of this encounter and this situation. I think those are both valid. Those aren't arbitrary decisions.
I think when you remove a player's agency just to make a story point, if a player can show you raw why his plan should succeed, and you take that away from him, I think that's I don't think that's good. I think that breaks the sacred contract essentially. Like I mean, like the rules are what like ensures that we're doing something besides playing a magical game of Calvin ball in our heads. And like if you are willing to throw away those rules like whole hawk, then what are you doing?
That's not what I'm suggesting. It's one specific. I mean, if you think about all of the rules that are followed versus all of the rules that are broken, right? Hypothetically speaking, we're at percentages of less than 1% that the rules are being broken, right? It's just a particularly flashy example of the rules being broken, and I think that that's worth it, right? This is what this cast is all about, right? Having two competing perspectives on this whole thing, and I definitely think that it's worth it sometimes in order to break that sacred contract to really hammer something home. Obviously, you're not going to break it on every auto attack that this guy is going to put on a goblin because that's just dumb, right? But it's a tool that's in a GM's toolbox, and it's kind of criminal not to use it. And I think
I disagree with that entirely. I think using it is like a last resort. I think if you use it, you've admitted defeat that you can't do this the right way. But that's
the right way. Okay, this is an interesting kind of segue. The right way being using the rules.
Yes.
Right? It would have been the right way for me to say this guy has evasion and he hits a reflex save, right?
It would have been the right way for you to have set up that character to have evasion. And I guess to me as a player, it would have kind of been invisible if he randomly had evasion. But like part of that for me, at least when I'm GMing, is that if I can be honest with myself and say I did this within I don't change creature stat blocks mid-fight unless I've messed up, unless I've made the fight way too easy or way too hard. I always set that up way ahead of time. And that's kind of important to me as a GM to have essentially, at least, I can say to myself, everything I did in this fight was fair. And if my players died, it's not because I made some arbitrary decision. It's because they couldn't defeat the monster type of deal.
That's an interesting perspective. I think that fairness is, it's kind of important to a certain extent. I will throw anything under the bus to tell a good story, man. I do this less often now that I have a good mastery of the rules, and that because I'm dealing with a different subset of players, obviously. I used to not actually stat out monsters. I would just keep the fight going, and I would do the numbers such that when the fight was dragging, it ended. But when it needed to be hot, when it started, when there was big in tactics, right? It was big in tactics, and I thought, and I do still agree with this, and I do this with other people who are not you guys. I will build the fight to try and keep the tension of the fight at its highest that it possibly can be, right? And basically, anything under the hood that I can fuck around with in order to make that happen, it's fair game. I don't mind doing that whatsoever.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess that's a difference in style.
I also think a big thing is, really what I'm referencing is, I was running a 4E game for a lot of my friends who very much fit that theater kid vibe recently. And that was exactly how I did it, right? Like, it was really important to me that the game itself was paced, it was paced appropriately, and it was told the right way, and people were engaged by the story rather than being, kind of engaged by the mechanics. And I really had a leg up because none of my players really cared enough about my side of the rules that it mattered all that much. You know what I mean? Like, something that happens pretty commonly in our Pathfinder games is somebody can say a monster, right? And I just know it's a common monster. I just know what its stat block looks like in my head. Even if I can't name specific numbers, sure, yeah, I know that an ooze, when we go up against this ooze in Iron God, it's going to split a bunch of times, right? I remember that in my head. And so I know the rules, and I know when I'm being fucked with by the DM, because I know so much about what's going on the DM side. And I think that that's a big aspect to being, to being a Captain Crunch to being a Captain Crunch player.
Yeah, no, that's fair. No, I think this is something where we're just never going to see eye to eye on it, because you are in. I hesitate to say this. I don't mean it pejoratively, but you are kind of like a converted theater kid, whereas I was born in the crunch. I was born in the crunch and molded by it. You were simply adopted the crunch. Just because like it's. Like your experience is obviously also very different than mine, right? Like you started playing in high school with your friends. What I did was I checked the D&D books out of the library, obsessively read them, had no one to play with, and played Neverwinter Nights a bunch.
Oh my god!
So all of my
in which Mango just adds a little check to his like nerd cred, right?
I mean, that's what I did, right? Like it's not nerd like. But my library had copies of all the AD&T books, and like I always thought it was so cool, and I read all of it, and I never had anybody to play with, so it was just me imagining what I would do if I ever could play, and it was all about rules because I wasn't I always imagined myself as a player, and then the next big thing came along, which was Neverwinter Nights, which kind of gave me the ability to play D&D. Versus on a computer, which is video games are very crunchy. The Captain Crunch, being kind of, I think the genesis of a lot of Captain Crunch player are video gamers who want something a little bit different, and so that's that's my genesis, and your genesis is in a much more fluffy place. So I think that's fluffy in the story sense, not in a pejorative sense in any way.
Well, I think the difference between tabletop and video games is an important one. I can't remember for the life of me where I heard this paraphrased quote, but something that was kind of definitionally said was, tabletop games are governed by laws. And video games are governed by rules, right? Laws, there's an expectation of, commitment, right? But there's also procedure for them being broken, right? Like breaking the laws is a thing, whereas a rule is just something that is followed, right? I may be fucking up the terms. It could have been rule, law, flat, but like the idea was, you literally cannot.
Rules lawyers
no,
most
but my
important thing in a game.
my point is that there are in a video game you literally can't have the bad guy deflect that lightning bolt.
Sure.
It's impossible, right? Because it must happen in this certain way, and the flexibility that comes with being in tabletop is I can just break whatever rule I want at any time because I am the GM and I am God, functionally. The other half of that analogy, by the way, is that laws are supported. There's some like weird democracy to this. Like the power of the law comes from the people. Your laws only have power so long as your players, in this case, believe in them, kind of thing. So there's kind of like more in this analogy than I was really prepared to tackle. But
that sounds like the sacred contract to me, buddy.
Right, I'm just pointing out the difference between video games and tabletop games. I also would like to point out, and I think I've done a pretty successful job at this, at curbing some of my theater kid tendencies in the face of Captain Crunchy. I actually think my theater kid tendencies are seen in the games that we play. It's one of those things where I don't really mind going. I don't mind going down in a fight. I don't mind dying as much because I don't know. I'm almost used to that, right? It doesn't bug me on the same way that I've seen it bug other players.
Sure, but I don't mind going down in a fight if I think was a fair thing. Like, if I think that the GM just arbitrarily decided I was going down in the fight, I will not be happy. If, I went down in the fight because I went in balls deep as the wizard, then yeah, I'm okay with that. Or or because the rogue got the jump on me as the wizard, right? Like that's the way it goes sometimes. And I'm okay with that. Right? If I rolled a 47 perception and the rogue got the jump on me, I might be a little bit aggravated, but if I didn't, or if the GM made that roll for me, which is something that, as much as I will as I personally will always adhere to the raw dice rolls. I do recognize that as a tool in a toolbox. That I won't care as much. But I also think this kind of rolls into another point I wanted to make, which is very kind of related, I think, to this, which is you were talking about the difference between tabletops and video games, and I think especially in this system, or rather in the Pathfinder system and in the D&D system, that there's a lot of flexibility that's built into a lot of the other systems, right? Like, because essentially combat is so well defined in its box, I think it's harder to convincingly break those rules without, it's harder to bend those laws without essentially having your players riot, or at least feel bad type of deal, than it is for something like, so this is actually...
I would just like to point out, by the way, that there are plenty of players, myself included, who don't feel bad about those kinds of changes, even if they see them, right?
What do you mean?
I think that the natural inclination of theater kids is not to mind if the story is good.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I see that. I get your point.
Really, my point is, I don't think that there's a guarantee that if you break the rules, players are going to riot, right? That's something that certain types of players do, certainly, and I think it's something you run the risk of, and a GM should be cognizant of, sure. But there's no guarantee in my mind that is going to take place, anytime somebody bends or breaks a rule of combat.
So there's also like a level of egregiousness to it, right? Like we've talked about this. But, like, I think something like... I think this is kind of what struck me before about your example of cutting the cables versus deflecting the lightning bolt, right? Cutting the cables is kind of a tertiary thing that kind of falls a little bit outside of that combat system in a couple of ways, right? Like, it's modeling, cutting inanimate objects, which there are rules for doing that in combat, but it's not like it's like it's not like your character is going to be, I cut the cables every single combat you get into, right? Like, your character's usually going to be swinging the lightsaber.
One of your characters might do that.
Sure, but anyway, that's because...
Pot shots.
No,
pot
I mean, that's fair, but I build my characters to be... I build my characters to be different like that, right? Like, to kind of capture those rule systems and kind of force attention on them, which is, a different... That's, I think, a whole nother discussion for another time. But essentially, what's the best way for me to put this? Essentially, a system that is constantly in the spotlight, like say combat, like a system that's constantly being used and constantly being looked at by the players and by the GM, it's more likely that you'll notice when something's changed about it, right? Like when the color of that cube has changed, or when someone's taken a nick out of it so that it deflects lightning bolts type of deal. Just to be very sledgehammer with my analogy. Whereas something like rules for breaking things, or like, targeting a very small object, or like screwing with the structural properties of any particular building, those things don't come up as often generally, and because that's the case, I think they're easier to fudge without it feeling like it has as much, or where it feels like it's being like, I don't know what the best way to put this
Well,
is.
I think so. I get what you're getting at, right? And I think, I definitely think that there are degrees, right? I think on the one side, I've obviously explained a situation that I find that was totally fine, right? Cutting the cables doesn't make sense raw. It makes sense because story makes it make sense. That's an example of a good version of this. And, the lightning bolt thing is an example of the bad version of this, right? But I don't think, like where the line is in between those two kind of hypothetical extremes as to what's passable and what's not is exactly this calibration that we're talking about. And somewhere, if that line's at 75%, well, maybe we're talking with a bunch of, theater kids who are more than willing to accept this kind of crap, right? But if the line's at 25%, it's, this is where we're getting into Captain Crunch territory. I think that it's important to do it in combat. I think combat is a really, it's a big part of the game. It's really dramatic. It's where a lot of, big, heavy, kind of reversals and plot points come about. And so, to kind of ignore combat and say, oh, well, combat's such a giant system that I don't want to fuck with it. It's like, I think that's kind of a needless cutoff, right? Something like having a critical hit happen when it's not supposed to is a good tool in a toolbox, right? To put it as a moderate example in between those, those extremes somewhere.
Yeah, see, I absolutely don't agree with that. I think that just randomly inserting extra things there just makes the game not fair, right? Like, it just makes the game arbitrary, and I might as well be coloring in a coloring book.
This is an interesting concept because I find it kind of so it's like kind of an all or nothing thing, right? Is what that sounds like.
What do you mean?
Like, it sounds like if I give an enemy a crit, right, to heighten the tension, to put somebody, to like put somebody in the single digits, right? Maybe bring somebody under so that there's more tension or whatever. That's unfair, technically, right? Yeah. I am literally changing the system, right? But in my view, it's one rule that's being changed out of dozens and dozens that are being used constantly, and it's being changed for a purpose, right? That purpose is to raise stakes, make tension, drama, all of these things that are good, important story things, right? That make the game a better story.
Yeah, see,
any one of those rule fractions, right? One bending of a rule in order to give an enemy a crit that they wouldn't have otherwise gotten, that invalidates the entire system, and we might as well be coloring in coloring books.
Yeah, I mean, it's to a certain extent, yeah. Like, I feel like that if I have to break the rules mid-combat to make the combat have the appropriate amount of tension, that's just me failing to design the encounter properly. That's not like...
Right, but the encounter is based so much on RNG that you can do all the designing that you want, right? There's no way that you're going to be able to dictate how the dice roll come out so that you're creating the kind of melodrama that you want, right? The kind of story that you want.
My response is always going to be like, that's the way it goes sometimes. Sometimes the players slam dunk on the boss. Sometimes the boss slam dunks on the players. And while that might be up to RNG, that's ultimately the driving system or the driving mechanic behind the system.
See, man, okay. This is let's put our thespian hats on. All right, let's go get some Shakespeare. Okay, because man, I'm gonna put on a theater kid. Okay. I think those encounters suck. I fucking hate them. Like, it's a huge pet peeve of mine, and it's one of those things that I kind of accept it, right? And in certain contexts, it's fine, right? For instance, I don't mind it in Iron Gods, right? The game that's GM'd by our friend Nick. He's a very raw guy, and we are very crunchy players in that game, and it's kind of okay. And, that's okay. I don't mind because that game to me is much more about the mechanics than it ever was about the story, right? But this, man. Oh, it would bug me to all fucking get out if, we got to the final boss in a campaign and the wizard casts Disintegrate and the guy fails his fortitude save and he just gets one shot. How anticlimactic is that? That sucks. That sucks to be a part of, right? And I would take a million violations of the rules in order to make that encounter tense and interesting and fun and have kind of like dramatic weight, then kind of take this like.
See, I'm going to take the opposite stance, which is essentially if we get to like the final boss and like, somebody lands the super duper gun crit on the boss, and that's definitely going to take him out because, that's the way it goes. But then the GM waves his hand and says, but he deflects it. Just because I can't think of another example.
Well, okay. Well, let me
let me finish my
sure,
analogy. Is that that's, I mean, even if it's the not the final boss, right? It's like, well, why am I playing this game? I'm always going to dramatically win the fight. So why am I not just listening to Buddy tell me a story? Why am I actually trying to actively participate in it?
Because sometimes it doesn't happen that way, right? Like there's no. I understand what you're getting at, and I think it's like kind of a trust thing almost, right? Like, if this one rule gets broken, how can I ever trust my GM not to break all of these other rules all the time, right? I think that's a part of it, but I also think a part of it is it's a well. Like, so
just to counter to talk to that point immediately, right? Like, it's a trust thing, and if the GM's following the rules, then I don't need to trust the GM, right? Like,
right. But if the GM breaks one rule in order to, and you kind of see through it a little bit or whatever, how does it come down? Let me. Here's another piece of this, because I think another piece of this that we have definitely touched on that is definitely important, especially as you go from theatery side to crunchy side, right? Is how good you are at manipulating shit behind the scenes, right? I actually think Mark is pretty good at this. I'm sure he would refute me, but whatever. I'm pretty sure he does this a lot. I think part of it is you just have to have a really good mastery of the system in order for you, like, when that gun crit misses, right? And they're like, "Oh, what the fuck?" And you go, "He has deflect arrows," right? Technically speaking, that's within the rules. But if he didn't design the encounter with that guy having deflect arrows and he just gave it deflect arrows in order to create this moment of tension, that's the same kind of stuff I'm talking about, right? And I think being able to mask that appropriately is a big skill that goes a long way in terms of this stuff, right? In fact, if I would say anything was the major, I think if anything was the major kind of flub for myself when I deflected your lightning bolt, it wasn't giving him evasion and rolling a reflex save, right? That would have made everything fine. And it didn't happen, right? Whether or not he had evasion doesn't matter. Whether or not he succeeded his reflex save doesn't matter. I would have made him succeed a reflex save, and he would have had the evasion kind of applied in post-production. But it would have been sufficient to mask, and it would have achieved the kind of narrative effect that we're talking about. How do you feel about it in that kind of system? If there's no, if a rule is broken and no one is around to rules lawyer it, does it make you want to color in coloring books?
Obviously it's hard to talk to the player side if the player can't tell, but me from the GM side, part of what this game, when I GM, part of what it is to me is seeing the players flex their collective muscles, whether it be in tactics or in character design or in whatever, to defeat the encounter. And if on my side I'm changing things up, right, that makes the game less enjoyable for me as a GM, right? If I'm just cheating to make things, if I'm just cheating to make things be, approximately takes out 3/4 of the party's daily uses of abilities. That way, the boss fight is more challenging. That bothers me at a very fundamental level. Although I do agree with you. I think Mark's very good at kind of knowing when to shift those posts, right? And part of this is that I think of all of us, I run the closest to source material when I'm running an established campaign, and so I feel kind of I don't want to mess with a lot of the encounters in ways that aren't just giving extra health and more armor class, or just fiddling with numbers. But I think there's also kind of a piece to this, which I think you're right, which is that like if the encounter isn't set and like you go into it right, like there's kind of like Schrodinger's feats essentially, which are he may or may not have deflect arrows, depends on if he gets crit really hard on the first round. But if that's the case, that means that some other aspect of his, like, some feat he does have is definitely disappearing off the list. And similarly, if the players have somehow like investigated this ahead of time, right? Like they did their scouting, they figured out what this boss is all about. Then I can't change that. I can't give him a feat that he kind of exposes. And also if it doesn't fit, right? Like if the giant Cyclops suddenly is like, well, now he has a leveling monk and he swats the bullet away, right? Like that's
sure. I mean, yeah, we're splitting the hairs of this kind of, right? But the mask is certainly important, is what I'm hearing. The one kind of final question I have. Let's say, just kind of philosophically, this interests me. Let's say we're heading into an encounter in Hell's Rebels, right? Gonna hit the boss of this NPC. Now, you have gone and picked up Hell's Rebels volume whatever, and you know the stat block of this boss, right? And we get into the fight, and something along these lines happens, right? Nobody else in the party knows, right? Nobody else in the party knows that this guy never had deflect arrows or whatever. I gave him deflect arrows specifically to, do what I'm talking about, increase the tension, create drama, all of that kind of stuff. How does that make you feel personally? Would you tell other people, for instance? I wonder. Would you let everyone know that I'm secretly cheating behind the scenes? Right?
So the thing there is that like, seeing it in Hell's Rebels 1 isn't enough for me to because I do tinker with my encounters as well. I'm not as much as you do, obviously. Like I said, I usually restrict myself to just kind of numbers adjustments, but like going into a fight and a boss not having a feat that he doesn't have on the sheet, I kind of, in this kind of trust that that's part of the encounter that was designed. And so I'm not going to be mad that you accounted for that, right? Like, if one of the players' shtick is all he does is go invisible and is an annoying ass, then when enemies start showing up with the C invisibility, I'm not going to be mad so long as it's not, overbearing, right? Like, or if there's like, a plausible reason for it, right? Like this is kind of obvious in Mark's Rune Lord's game where it's like, well, in the tournament everybody knows how you guys kind of fight, so they're starting to take steps to directly counter you. And I think in a lot of these games, you can kind of make that same kind of like, well, you're heroes, and they heard about the heroes that were coming, and they heard that the heroes use invisibility, so they made sure to account for that type of deal. Or, the heroes use guns, so they have necklaces of bullet protection, type of deal. And so I don't think that, like, that your specific example wouldn't bother me at all. But if, like, let's say, like, for a analogous situation, if you said, here's the stat block, study the stat block because you're gonna be fighting this monster, and you found like the item of generating stat blocks, and it tells you exactly what the stat block is, and then you fought it, then you had us fight it, and it wasn't that stat block, I would be aggravated. It's kind of a hard.
I see where you're getting at.
Yeah, it's kind of a hard.
Honestly, the core thing here that really just kind of that I find most interesting is this idea that any violation of the rules is too much of a violation of the rules, right? Like that I find, because it's definitely one of those things where I don't. You know what I mean? Like it's not like it's not like like, I don't want you to not trust me when it comes to Hell's Rebels, right? Like, because of this conversation. I'm not going to be fucking with every fight.
No, I'm sure you're
This
not.
is like a once in every couple of sessions just to make a boss counter, you know, like, really make it pop or whatever, right? That kind of thing. I think that's important.
Sure.
But I really find it interesting that it's just kind of like, you know.
I think there's some nuance there, too. I wanted to bring this up a little bit earlier, but there wasn't really a good moment for it, right? Like, I think part of this is that, again, that mechanics is such a forward thing in Pathfinder, right? Like, you know, if, you know, you've got an engine, like, you know, if you've got somebody who can go up to the tower and it's like, that tower, I've got knowledge engineering, can I, like, figure out a way to knock it over or something? You know, that happens once, right? Like, you know, going to Rule of Cool for that, to me, is appropriate. If that character decides that his thing is everything, every time he sees a tower, he knocks it over with a knowledge engineering check or, you know, something similar, that's when you kind of start to adhere to the rules, or like you go more strictly to the rules, because that's like that's how that character operates, and in order for that character to be fair and not be essentially abusing the rule of cool, because it's not cool anymore, it's become mundane.
Oof, this is actually kind of a segue into another topic.
If as much as because that's the case, you have to let that, like, you kind of have to look at those things, right? Like, when I was playing Log back in Mark's first Rune Lords campaign, I was playing a Sundering character, right? Like, that's what I did. And so, you know, whereas once in a while, if, like, there's this, we've had this fight in our Rune Lords game, and something kind of similar happened. But there's this fight in a sawmill, and there's a point where you're fighting on the top floor above some saws, and, you know, I could see in a very typical game somebody, like, attempting a bull rush, or like, you know, using their hammer to try and crack the floor, and then the GM being like, you know what, that's cool, that's innovative, I will hand wave you a circumstantial bonus type of deal on your roll. But when I'm playing Log, right, I fully expect every single one of those Sunder checks to be by the book, because he's been doing Sunder checks all game and all campaign. Like, I don't expect any leniency there, because it's become mundane, essentially. And my argument here is that not all aspects of combat, but, like, a lot of combat is so mundane that breaking those rules kind of, you know, like this is kind of formulating now, but, like, you know, the counterpart to the rule of cool is the rule of mundane, right? Rule of cool means things that are cool have a higher chance of succeeding, whereas to me, rule of mundane is mundane things are by the book. And combat falls a lot into the mundane for me.
Interesting. That's kind of an interesting... Wow. So another kind of piece of this that I wanted to dig into a little bit was the idea of... Because I think we're kind of describing two separate game systems almost, and they kind of complement themselves with a certain perspective on how player agency kind of works. I think it sounds to me like your games are built primarily almost for, like, kind of player expression, right? Like,
yes.
Where players get to, this is a vehicle for players to express themselves using this incredibly complicated system, right? Whereas my games are a little bit more focused towards, you know, narrative, characters, plot, theme, settings, writing degree stuff, right?
Sure.
Another aspect of that is how you and I look at the way people choose classes a little bit differently. Because we once had a conversation where I said something along the lines of, you shouldn't play an Oracle, or, you know, it might not have been Oracle, but it was probably something similar to that. Like, you know, you shouldn't play this class unless you're willing.
I think it was War Priest and, like, Paladin maybe, or War Priest and Inquisitor.
Yeah. Right, okay, yeah, that definitely was. You know, like, you shouldn't play a Paladin over a War Priest unless you're willing to adhere to a Paladin's edicts, right? Like, that, you know, like, I understand that that's just RP, right? There's really no mechanic there. I mean, there is one technically, but like nobody ever.
Paladin's special, so I might specifically not agree with this point, but something like a war priest versus a cleric, I think is a anyway. Finish
sure,
your point.
sure. Same thing, right? Like, if you tell me I want to play, you know, like I want to play a priest of whatever, right? And I just like war priest mechanics better, but I really just kind of want to be like a normal priest or whatever. You would let that person play a war priest, even though technically, you know, by the flavor, right? Like by the lore, they're not, right? By the lore, they would be a cleric, right? Or, you know, maybe an oracle, or maybe one of these other kind of myriad other classes.
To push that to the extreme, which is, I think, the third example I gave, which is kind of like, you know, you can be a lay priest of Viamade and just be a fighter by class levels type of deal.
Right.
Which is the kind of the extreme end of that spectrum.
That to me is a very strange concept. I really think that these, you know, like, I think that the flavoring classes is really important, and I think that, you know, holding players to that is a big fucking deal, right? If you want to say that you're a chosen one of Iomade, right, and that Iomade has specifically blessed you with these powers, you must play an oracle. There is no way that you can play a cleric with that, because that's just not the lore of a cleric, right? And you know, I don't know.
See,
I think that's really important.
I don't have those, like, I would disagree with you that that's like the lore of a cleric, right? Like, I don't, or the lore of an oracle, right? Like, especially given some of the examples, but I don't think that that's necessarily true. I think, you know, in some specific cases, there are these kind of things. Like, I think Cavaliers and Paladins are pretty heavily tied to their lore implications. But I think on the whole, for most classes, that's not true, right? Like, whether a crazy wooden being has, like, whether you believe a crazy wooden being has given you wooden powers, as an oracle, or you know, or as like a phytokineticist, right? I don't think that distinction is particularly important. I don't think that, like, kind of, like, I don't think that. I don't think that every oracle has to be the oracle that they give in the example, like, you know, that they give in the iconic section of their class book.
Sure, that's not what I'm saying either, right? But, like, it's, you know, maybe a better way to think about this would be wizard and sorcerer, right? If I'm playing a wizard, that means that I studied, right? Sure. Fundamentally. I can't be a wizard and just pop out of the womb casting spells. I can be a sorcerer and do that. That's what sorcerers do, right? But even if a player told me that I want to play a sorcerer, but I want it to be the mechanics of a wizard, I would just never let that go. They would have to play the sorcerer if they wanted that flavor. They would have to choose that class. That's that's kind of like a tough shit.
Yeah, but I think that there's a flexibility. Like, I think there's a flexibility there. Like, you know, this is going to come down to individual situation in a lot of cases, right? Like, if a player came to me and said, true. You know, I want to be a wizard, but I want to be a prodigy that mastered basic magic by the age of 15, right? Like, I don't really have a problem with that, right? Like, if that's the kind of thing you're going for, like, yes, I think you have to have that aspect of studying rather than of innate talent. And I think this actually comes to a head a lot around kind of the divine classes, because I think, at least thematically, outside of Paladin, the divine classes are a little bit more kind of loose, right? Like, the difference between a war priest of Iomade, a cleric of Iomade, and a fighter that worships Iomade, in terms of fluff, they can be near identical, right? Like, you know, there are some instances where, you know, they're going to have less of a direct commune with the god, right? But, like, the idea of a lay priest is not something that is so out there that I would deny a player that.
Right, but I think that there's a huge difference between a cleric and a lay priest, right? One of them specifically gets power from their god, right? Like, that's an unequivocal fact. You can be a lay priest, right? But you still can't cast heal. No matter, you know, like, you can worship Serenray all you want. You're never going to get there. And I think that when you take a look at it from that perspective, you kind of have to backtrack it to a certain amount where, you know, how does that person kind of, like, end up in however they end up? How does them being a lay priest kind of like influence that stuff?
See, I think that like I think the kind of the thing I'm driving at is that like, you know, there's nothing in the rule book that says that all of the people that Serenre loves get magical powers, right? Like, it would not bother me if like the head priest of a church was a fighter that, you know, just never received any kind of magical blessing.
Yeah,
like,
no, that's
his blessing from his god was his martial prowess, if you want to flavor it that way. Not, you know, like, you know, his god blessed him with, you know, like, you know, God has blessed me with these talents, and I shall use them in her service.
And I definitely think that, you know, like, I think it makes more sense for a barbarian to be the high priest of Gorum to get Greyhawk in here than it does for a cleric to a certain extent, right? Like, somebody could make that argument to me, and it would make a lot of sense. But like, you know, I think that there's a sacred contract between the mechanics and the flavor, like the mechanics and the fluff, and it's something that really does have to be, you know, it has to be respected in certain cases, like with the paladin, right? But I think it has to be respected in other cases. You can't play a sorcerer who was born without magic.
I think that I can find a raw example for you of that's not being true. Like, I think...
Really? Is there a raw example of that?
I think one of the flavoring... Like, it's not something that's going to be much different.
Oh, like an archetype or something for it?
Or not even an archetype, but, like, the story... Like, you know, like, somebody with the ectoplasmic bloodline was dropped in a vat of ectoplasm or something and developed magical powers. Like not something that's super different from what you're saying, but, like, you know, I think you're right that, like, there has to be some sort of, like, innateness to it, right? Like,
right. So nobody could play the two parallel. This is like two parallel characters, right? Two characters who are exactly the same fluff wise, but also be different classes.
Right? So. I think that's untrue. I think that would be true for something.
Man.
I think that would be true for something like Wizard and Sorcerer. I agree with you that you can't play the same character exactly fluff wise over those two characters, although, again, I might be able to find, like, an alternate bloodline somewhere that's, like, supposed to be sorcerers that study, and, you know, I might be able to make an argument for that, but, like, I think in the general case, you're right, you can't do that with Wizard and Sorcerer.
But if it was Ranger and Fighter, right?
If it was Ranger and Fighter, or this is probably the strong, the one you're going to object more strongly to, War Priest and Paladin, which is essentially like, you can be a lawful good war priest and be the exact same fluff as a paladin, because they're essentially they're very similar to each other, I think, in that lore space.
So I think this kind of comes down to is there a fluff difference between these classes? To me, I look at that and I say that those people are playing their characters wrong. Right, you can't have a character that's run entirely independent of your class like that. You being a paladin or you being a war priest is going to change you. You're going to focus on things and think about things in a different way. And if you're not doing that, that's bad.
So maybe if we were talking about like a paladin and like a druid, I might get behind that. But what is so fundamentally different about a paladin and a war priest that their life experiences are going to make them different? Like, they're both warriors in service of their deity that gain magical powers based on that worship, and they might take different forms at some point, but the form of that power is almost entirely irrelevant to the fluff of the character.
But the almost that you just used there is exactly what I'm getting at, right? Like the mechanics of a smite are much different than the mechanics of a, sacred weapon. I don't really know this stuff all that well. Spoiler alert for listeners who don't necessarily know this. I do not like paladin fluff for this very same reason. And so in all of my games, paladins are oriented much more towards, divine-based alignment warriors who kind of get their power from their alignment rather than from a specific deity. But that notwithstanding, right, that almost makes a big difference to me, right? If the war priest is playing exactly like the paladin, if the war priest is I guess fluffing exactly as a paladin, it means that he's fluffing smite, which doesn't make any sense.
If I hit an enemy with my empowered hammer, and I hit him real good, I have smote him. I may not have smite him the mechanic, but I have smote him as per the dictionary. I have smote him in the name of my God, and by God, he will suffer.
Right, but there's a difference between me getting a critical hit with my sacred weapon, right? You know, that might put out the same amount of damage as me, you know, smiting this guy and hitting him, but it doesn't behave the same way smite does, and that behavior is a big that's important to me.
I don't
right?
think
I think
so.
That's important from a flavor.
This might get back to some of our earlier stuff, but I don't think that I don't think the specifics of that behavior in like a round of combat are particularly important to like. I don't think the fact that I used the smite mechanic and did 32 points of holy damage is particularly important to the story. I think I hit the guy real good with my hammer is the important part.
Sure, but it's well, actually, not sure. I don't agree with this. It's kind of like the mechanics have a message, right? Like the mechanics imply certain things. When I smite the bad guy and I just sit there and wail on him, I am acting as my that is optimum paladin, right? And that's how paladin and hypothetically speaking, optimum paladin mechanically should kind of like bleed into optimum paladin flavorfully. Right, where that's the way a paladin orients their thought process. Whereas it might not be efficient for a war priest to do that. Right, that just might not be like that in the exact same situation. A war priest might not need to do that because the mechanics of the fight ask him to do something different. And if the war priest ignores that, they're tantamount to ignoring kind of this flavor bonus, like not bonus, this flavor core to their class. And that to me is that's the sin being committed, right? This is the crime, and this is why I think that this stuff is important.
I don't think that there's nearly as tight of a flavor tie as you think there is to each class. Like I think if the war priest is built for smiting his enemies in the colloquial sense, that he is just as much a man who smites his enemies as a paladin is. And if for one round of combat he goes and heals his friend instead of laying the smack down on his enemy, I don't think that fundamentally changes the character in such a way that he is completely that he is so completely different from a paladin that they can't be effectively the same character.
Well, I think the term effectively is really what it comes down to, right? Because like we agree that in an extreme scenario, right, there is no way that a wizard can have the exact same fluff as a, I don't know, brawler, right? Like that,
sure.
that can't happen, right? But the thing is, as far as I'm concerned, you can get as close as you want, but there's always got to be a difference there. You know what I mean? Like that, there's no point in my mind where effectively, quote unquote, like becomes strong enough to stop this, this phenomenon from happening in my head, where I think it's like a poor, it's a poor character concept.
I think you're too married to your made up rules about fluff. Like I just don't see these kind of implications there that you see. Like again, I'll say like maybe I see them for the paladin, but I really don't see them there for most of the classes. Like fighter versus brawler, ranger versus ranged fighter.
I mean, hypothetically speaking, we agree on the vast majority of this, right? The vast majority of these comparisons happen between Magus and Druid, right? And
sure.
So 90% of these comparisons are in a no-go zone, and it's just whether or not the line is at 10% or it's at 1%. I mean, really what this comes down to kind of like back it up to a cerebral top-down level is I do think that you should choose your class for more than just lore reasons, right? You need to consider the flavor and the fluff of your class when you're going into it, and I think that's an important piece of the puzzle that. I just don't think it's I just don't think it's as strong as you want it to be. Like I don't think that being an avatar of the spirit of the forest is any less a druid than a wood oracle. If you were the exact same one, that would bug me. If you can have that general character concept, and that's fine.
Sure.
Right. It doesn't bug me that the Wooden Wanderer isn't a druid, for instance, because he is flavored very Oracle as far as I'm concerned. This is also like, now that I think about this, this is so like in the realm of like possibility. I don't think I've ever seen a character that would fall along these lines and would bug me because they did. You know what I mean? I don't think I've ever seen anybody play a character that I'm just like, man, that really should have been a fucking sorcerer.
Yeah, I think I see what you're saying. And I think that's kind of like maybe where we've kind of missed each other, is that like, I don't, like, if I were going to play an Avatar of the Forest and I went with it, Wood Oracle, or I went with Druid with it, they're going to manifest in different ways just kind of by nature of their mechanics. But to me, those are the same character to me in some ways, right? Like one might have a bear and one might summon trance occasionally, but like I think my effectively is a lot looser than yours, which is the big difference here. Or at least effective fluff wise, right? Like you could, to me, if I throw these two characters in the same situation and they respond in like what is. When I say situation, I mean like a story situation. They respond in the same way. They're the same type of character to me. Whether or not like Fozzie is sitting there, or the Rotfather is smiling down from above, is not so important. It's not so important in a lot of situations to me.
Right, but a lot of situation implies those few situations where it is important.
Okay, so
and I think we're in agreement,
right? Like whether or not Fozzie is sitting there is not important because they can both be following the Rotfather. One is just through this kind of like druid path, and the other is through this Wood Oracle path.
Yeah, I feel that to a certain extent. I also think that I think it's important from the top down to make sure that if somebody said to me, I really want to play a wizard, but I hate wizard mechanics, so I'm going to play a wizard with sorcerer mechanics, I would never allow that to happen. That would bug the fuck out of me. Even if it was something super close, right? Like, if somebody says, I know that this matches Brawler more than it does Fighter, but I'm going to play it as a Fighter, that bugs me. I wouldn't let that happen. I would say you either have to change your fighter, however small or large that change would have to be to make it align, right? Though I'm pretty sure it wouldn't have to be all that big. Or you suck it up and you play the fucking brawler, right? Like,
see, I think with the martial classes, this also blurs a lot heavier, right? Like, I don't see a situation where I couldn't play a fighter that had those kind. Like, I think that like because fighter's been around for forever and is the most boring class, or the most flexible class, rather, to put it more charitably, on the face of the planet. I think because like of that, like I'm pretty sure there's an archetype for brawling, whether or not like in that kind of flavor, right? Like
there definitely is one. And there's also like there's that feat that gives you like kind of like baby's first martial flex.
Sure.
That's
sure, but
you could create a rough approximation.
So to your kind of point about this wizard who's like, I hate the wizard mechanics, I want to be a sorcerer. If he said to me, oh, I'm going to be an arcanist, I'd say that's like arcanist, I wouldn't blink an eye, or I wouldn't bat an eye. Or if he said I forgot the name of one of the alternate bloodlines, maybe Imperial. No, Imperial I think lets you use wisdom instead of Sage is the bloodline, I think, for that lets you kind of use int and be like kind of more of like a wizardy sorcerer. If he says I'm going to be a wizard by being a sage, by being a sage sorcerer, I'd say that's probably okay, right? Like, where I'm going to be a man who studies magic, right? Like, and I use the sage sorcerer, and mechanically it's like from some like kind of upwelling within him, rather than by the efforts of his studying. Ultimately, to the character, that doesn't make a difference, right? Like,
well, and I also think to a certain extent, right, to your wizard arcanist thing, I think that there are like if you were to ask me to like map this out on like maybe like a pie graph, right, or like a Venn diagram, actually is what I mean to say. There's a heaping helping of character concepts that are covered in that Venn diagram, both by like arcanist and by wizard,
sure.
Right? Like if somebody wants to tell me a guy who likes fucking magic, sure, that could be that could be that's fine. But the more specific you go, right? Like as we
magic.
Yeah. As we go more and more specific, right, and we drill down deeper and deeper into the character, though, that overlap will eventually disappear, and we will land, kind of either in Arcanist territory or Wizard territory. And I think that like, the fact that you land in one of those two specifically is kind of
okay. I think,
kind of important.
I think I see what you're getting at, and to me, well, at least in my experience, what usually ends up happening is before I even get anywhere close to drilling down far enough in a fluff analysis to get to drop into one of those two things, I'll be like, well, these are your options, and a player will choose themselves the class and kind of adjust the fluff minorly as necessary, which is I think kind of the.
I think what we've just hit on is that this problem that we're talking about is entirely made up. No way would this ever happen in real life, right? It's just a principles thing.
I think so. The reason this came up in the first place, and I think part of where this problem is quote unquote real is in a shared world space, right? Where like two people are running something in the same world, and one person says, well, in my game, this character is a paladin. And in my game, this same character who is, the head of the same church or whatever is a war priest. And I think that's where this kind of disagreement comes. This is exactly where it came to a head.
That is exactly where it came from.
Yeah.
Just some backstory for our listeners. Mango, myself, Mark, and our friend Nick have been kind of on the sly working on an alternate campaign setting that is so contentious that none of us agree on the pronunciation of the term for this campaign setting. But, we definitely had this kind of conversation, and I think, that bugs me. That really bugs me. Holy shit does that bug me. If you're a war priest, you're a fucking war priest. I don't care if you're a Mango's game or you're a Nick's game. You're not allowed to just, swap to paladin. That just doesn't, that doesn't happen.
Yeah, see, that wouldn't bother me at all. But that, that's I think a difference of kind of of implication, which is, I don't know, I think what we've kind of hit on is like there's a level that you and I kind of consider acceptable deviation. For me, right, like, the difference between you telling the story and me telling the story is going to be so much greater than the difference between a war priest and a paladin that I don't give a shit.
Whereas, yeah, that's fair.
I
understand with that mindset.
Whereas I guess that you feel that they're so much more informed by the class that's a more important deal. And I think that's just something we're going to have to rest on as a difference of opinion.
I also think it's one of those things where in this hypothetical scenario, ironically, making a hard line here, kind of like a hard line in the sand, is important to allowing freedom for that character, right? Like, the character wouldn't have to rebuild their entire class from the ground up, their entire thing from the ground up, because Mark hates paladins and doesn't allow paladins in his game, right? So, if somebody wants to guest star on Mark's game, he doesn't have to rebuild himself entirely as a war priest. He can just bring in his paladin and we can all have a jolly good time.
Yeah, so I'm kind of sad that Mark isn't here because Mark, I think, is all the way at the other end, which is that you don't need paladin, war priest, cleric, or fighter. They can all be an inquisitor, which bothers the fuck out of me. So
really, that's kind of interesting. I fall a little bit, but that's mostly because I see a pretty substantial fluff difference between those classes, with the caveat that paladins are alignment warriors. I think they bleed too much into war priests otherwise.
So that bothers me not for as much fluff reasons as if it doesn't matter, why not let the players play with other mechanics? But I think that's a discussion for another time.
We'll probably make a whole episode out of that. Who the fuck knows?
Yeah.
Because we're super good at planning out our episodes in advance.
Always and forever. But yeah, I think that's about all we've got time for. So it's time to wrap things up. This has been Some Derps Talk About Games. If you'd like to watch us play any of these games, you can catch us on Twitch. Catch us on twitch.tv/somederpsplaygames. If you would like to email us and tell us why we're wrong, you can email us at somederpsplaygames@gmail.com. That's somederpsplaygames@gmail.com. I'll put a link in the description to both of those places. Rune Lords isn't happening this week. Iron God should happen tomorrow, which will probably happen before I edit and put up this episode. So look forward to the next week, which will hopefully have both games of Iron Gods and Rune Lords. And then whenever Iron Gods ends, we'll be starting up Hell's Rebels.
Hell's Rebels will probably be past that New Year's Eve line. We may or may not do an introductory kind of one shot, so we'll probably make an announcement when that kind of thing happens. But, it's December, holidays are happening, people are fucking hectic and shit, so we are a little bit up in the air.
Yeah, and since I will be home for the holidays, you guys might get a sneak peek into, I might run the games that I run in person for a couple sessions on Roll20, which I will broadcast if any of you want to see those shit shows featuring Thomas Shanks, the worst character ever created.
Is he really the worst character ever? That you've ever DM'd?
He's definitely the worst character that I have ever DM'd. I think
Is he the worst character you've ever played with in a group?
I think so.
Wow. Jeez.
It's kind of like all of the annoyingness of like a Gish Mage, like Lawrence used to play, with none of the cleverness of mechanics and all of the obnoxiousness of the player. Wow,
those are some harsh words. Harsh words of
to be fair,
criticism.
the player's other character, Lord Maxwell Silver, Duke of Twilight, First Lieutenant of Abadar's Enforcers, is much better and much less annoying.
I'm sure that one day we're speaking, of course, of our friend Zhao. We will have Zhao on the cast, and he can defend his choices on Thomas Shanks,
who
has the most annoying name ever. I hate his name so much.
I am never letting much. So just to let you viewers in on his defense of this character. His defense of this character was not like anything sensible. It's that the goal for a character should be to be as disruptive as possible, in almost those exact words. And I was like,
"Oh,
I hate you."
Cancer. I just got it.
Yeah, Thomas Shanks almost died in our last session, and I wasn't sad. I was kind of rooting for it, but then the party healer had to go and heal him.
God damn, what the fuck were they thinking?
Yeah. But
anyway,
until next time, dear listeners.
Until next time, dear listeners. I won't call you viewers this time.
Yeah, this has been some Derps Talk About Games.